He falls in love at first sight with his boss's newly married wife. The woman's gentle smile mixed with a hint of anxiety instantly captures Steven's heart. At the dinner table, Steven cannot help but keep letting his eyes drift toward her, and the woman seems to notice Steven's burning gaze. When their eyes unexpectedly meet, Steven's heart surges with emotion and refuses to calm down. During their conversation, Steven surprisingly learns that the woman shares his deep love for music. Even more astonishing, their favorite piano piece is the same obscure composition called The Lark. Compared to Steven, however, the woman's husband understands nothing about music, his mind filled only with business schemes and rivalries. In front of everyone, he openly criticizes his wife's love for music. Hearing her husband's harsh remarks, Isa feels deeply hurt, yet she still forces a faint smile onto her lips. But her husband completely ignores Isa's feelings and continues talking endlessly. In the end, Isa can only excuse herself by saying she has a headache before getting up and leaving, because Steven is a machine designer whom the boss has hired from Britain at great expense. To show how much he values Steven, the boss specially arranges for him to live in his own house. But after moving into the boss's home, Steven cannot sleep at all. He stands silently in front of the mirror, lost in thought, while Isa's image continues appearing before his eyes. Unable to fall asleep, he finally steps out of his room, only to unexpectedly hear the boss's harsh shouting from the bedroom along with Isa's quiet sobbing. Steven slowly moves closer, trying to hear more clearly, but suddenly the boss opens the door. Fortunately, the alert Steven quickly hides around the corner and avoids being discovered. Half a year earlier, Isa married the boss, a widower with a son and a daughter, becoming his second wife. But she and her husband share nothing in common, and her husband has an extremely violent temper, often humiliating and tormenting Isa for no reason. Isa's painful situation only awakens an even stronger desire in Steven to protect her. One day the boss takes his family, friends, and Steven on a countryside outing. The boss and his friends concentrate on fishing from a wooden boat, but Steven's thoughts are nowhere near the fishing. Sitting by the riverside, he keeps glancing at Isa, who is quietly absorbed in reading. Suddenly Isa lifts her head and gives him a gentle smile. That single smile completely captures Steven's heart, and Steven finally finds a chance to be alone with Isa while everyone else is taking a nap. He carefully asks Isa why she was quietly crying in the night. Isa remains silent for a few seconds without answering, then turns and walks away. On the way back, the two of them sit facing each other in the wooden boat, both remaining silent. Suddenly the sound of wild ducks from the shore catches Isa's attention. Isa quickly turns to look toward the sound, but her foot accidentally touches Steven's foot. Steven slowly lowers his head after noticing it, realizing this is the first intimate contact between him and Isa. He does not know whether Isa did it intentionally or by accident, but at this moment his heart is filled with happiness. He slowly lifts his head and looks at Isa across from him, and Isa seems to sense his thoughts, yet she does not pull her foot away. The two of them remain silent, simply sitting there quietly. Isa slowly turns her gaze towards Steven. At the moment their eyes meet, although neither of them speaks a word, it feels as if thousands of unspoken words have already been shared. One day, while passing time by sketching at a small restaurant on a street corner, Steven unexpectedly catches sight of Isa. He immediately rushes into the street as if possessed, closely following behind Isa, but he does not dare step forward to face her, so he simply keeps walking silently behind her. He walks for a long time without realizing it, until he finally sees Isa enter a man's house. The man's cautious and watchful glances in every direction seem to reveal that he must share some hidden secret with the boss's wife. The sharp-minded Steven instantly concludes that Isa can no longer endure her husband's cruelty and has already found a lover outside her marriage. At that moment, Steven suddenly feels like a complete fool. In his heart Isa has always been pure, kind, and almost untouchable, and he never imagined she could be this kind of woman. The next morning, as Steven is about to leave for work, he unexpectedly runs into Isa, who has just returned home. Steven finally asks about what he saw on the street the day before. Still clinging to a trace of hope, he even invents a reasonable excuse for her, asking if she had gone to visit a friend. How he wishes Isa would simply say yes, but Isa quietly replies that she has no friends. After saying this, Isa immediately turns and walks away, leaving Steven standing there alone with his heart in turmoil. At that moment, the beautiful image of Isa in his heart completely collapses. He originally plans to tell the boss about Isa secretly meeting another man, but when he sees the hot-tempered boss once again shouting at and humiliating poor workers, he hesitates again and finally says nothing. That day, the new machine Steven designed for the boss is finally put into production. Because the new machine reduces labor costs, many workers who have been laid off gather in front of the factory to protest. Yet facing the workers' anger, the boss says nothing and simply chooses to ignore them. Steven also unexpectedly notices that among the dismissed workers is the very man ISA secretly met before. Outside the factory, the dismissed workers shout in protest, while inside the boss happily praises Steven's new machine for increasing production. Steven only listens to the praise in silence, hearing the cries of the laid-off workers outside. A painful sense of guilt suddenly fills Steven's heart. Steven finally learns from the workers that the kind-hearted ISA often secretly brings food to these laborers who are exploited by the boss whenever her husband is not around, helping them survive their difficult lives. Many struggling workers have received ISA's quiet help. Realizing that he has misunderstood ISA, Steven feels a surge of joy. The image of ISA as kind, pure, and noble rises again in Steven's heart, even higher than before. That afternoon he unexpectedly hears ISA playing the piano piece The Lark. The Lark is a very obscure piano composition, yet this little-known piece happens to be the favorite of both Steven and ISA. This shared love for the music is one of the most important reasons why Steven is so deeply fascinated by ISA. At that moment Steven can no longer suppress the admiration in his heart, and he gathers the courage to slowly approach her. He gently places his hand on her shoulder as if touching a beloved partner, but when the woman turns around, Steven realizes in shock that she is not ISA but ISA's older sister. The sister immediately sees through Steven's feelings, yet instead of stopping him she subtly encourages him to pursue what his heart desires, because she hopes her sister ISA can experience true love instead of remaining trapped in an imperfect marriage arranged by their father. With the sister's encouragement, Steven finally gathers the courage to pursue ISA, and soon he finally receives his opportunity. 2 days later, the boss leaves town on a business trip for a major order. Before leaving, he even entrusts Steven, the man he values most, to oversee the factory's production. ISA's sister also thoughtfully leaves in advance, giving Steven the chance he has been waiting for. In truth, after spending many days together, ISA has already sensed Steven's feelings. She also has a deep fondness for this gentle, kind-hearted young man who shares her interests and passions. With her husband away and the daughter from her husband's previous marriage just leaving the dining table, Steven slowly lifts his head and begins to confess his love. The woman seems to notice Steven's burning gaze, and after several seconds of silence she stands up, preparing to leave. Yet Steven suddenly grabs her and kisses her. ISA, who has long felt the same affection for Steven, suddenly finds her mind completely blank, torn between refusing and accepting him. The responsibility of marriage and the freedom of love leave her unable to decide what choice she should make. But at the last moment, she forcefully pushes Steven away and quickly runs out of the room, leaving Steven standing there alone in stunned silence. Steven is filled with anger and believes that he has failed. Yet unexpectedly, ISA suddenly returns after leaving. Between the marriage arranged by her father and the love she has fallen into, ISA finally chooses the latter. Steven follows ISA as she slowly walks toward the boss's bedroom, but at the moment she reaches the door, ISA hesitates once again. Steven directly takes her hand and firmly pushes the door open. Once inside the room, the two of them completely abandon all restraint. At that moment, every moral rule in the world no longer matters to them. In their eyes there is only each other, only love. 2 days later, the boss returns from his trip and excitedly tells his assistant Steven that he has finally secured a huge order. But Steven simply stares at the boss in silence, thinking about how much the boss values him. Steven cannot help falling into deep guilt. On one side is the boss's trust and respect, on the other is the love his heart longs for. Steven tells himself he should not treat the boss this way, yet whenever he sees ISA he cannot control himself. Caught in this constant inner conflict, he continues secretly meeting ISA again and again. One day, while sitting in the garden lost in thought, still struggling with his conflicting emotions, someone suddenly walks up behind Steven and covers his eyes. Steven thinks it is ISA, but when he turns around he realizes it is the daughter from the boss's previous marriage. Startled, Steven instinctively shifts backward, yet the girl suddenly confesses her feelings to him and says she already knows about Steven and ISA. She hopes Steven will end his relationship with ISA and choose to be with her instead, saying that she is younger and more beautiful than ISA. The girl insists that she and Steven are the ones truly meant to be together. As she speaks, she even takes Steven's hand and slowly moves closer to him, but Steven ultimately rejects her. Panicked, Steven immediately runs to tell ISA what has happened. He worries the girl will reveal the truth to the boss, and he even suggests that he and ISA should run away together, but ISA simply comforts him and says it will be fine because the girl will not tell her husband. ISA is so certain because she does not truly believe Steven's story. Before this, Steven has already suggested more than once that they should run away together. Although ISA loves Steven in her heart, she does not want to leave her husband, so she has never agreed. This time she still believes it is only another excuse Steven invented to persuade her to leave. Yet that very night at the dinner table, her husband suddenly exposes the secret relationship between Steven and ISA with a cold and serious expression. The boss is shocked to discover that his newly married wife is having an affair with the assistant he trusts the most. He never imagined that the man he hired with a high salary and even allowed to live in his home out of respect would repay him in this way. Furious, he angrily condemns Steven's betrayal. Yet Steven insists that his love for ISA is genuine. Hearing this, the boss becomes even more enraged and demands to know what that makes him. Does that mean he is the third person interfering in their love? Feeling guilty, ISA also hurriedly apologizes sincerely to her husband, and the boss chooses to forgive her but immediately orders Steven to leave. Yet ISA suddenly says that if Steven is forced to leave, she will not stay either. In the end, ISA chooses her lover over her husband. Powerless, the boss can only watch angrily as they disappear from his sight. Knowing that life will become difficult after leaving her husband, ISA quickly runs upstairs to pack her belongings while her husband is still downstairs in anger. Yet he soon rushes upstairs and drives her out. Under the boss's furious orders, the two of them flee the house in haste. After successfully escaping, the two of them sit in a carriage and burst into excited laughter. In their hearts they believe that love is worth giving up everything. After leaving the boss, ISA's life is no longer as wealthy as before, but she feels happy every day, because she can finally be openly together with the man she loves. Steven's companionship makes up for the lack of material comfort. ISA's sister also often comes to visit her and tries to help them financially whenever she can. Seeing the new clothes her sister brings, ISA is filled with joy, but her happiness makes Steven fall into deep self-blame. He believes he has failed to give ISA, who grew up in comfort, the life she deserves. Soon the two of them have their first argument. ISA wants to have a child, believing that a child is the embodiment of love and an essential part of a family, but Steven believes their financial situation is not good enough to raise a child. More importantly, Steven lost both of his parents when he was young, and the painful hardships of his childhood remain a shadow he can never erase. He believes that if he cannot guarantee a good life and education for a child, then he should not bring one into the world. He does not want his own painful childhood to repeat itself in his child's life. ISA, who has grown up in comfort, naturally cannot fully understand the suffering Steven experienced as a child. Because of this issue about having a child, the two of them fall into arguments again and again. ISA's sister also tries many times to persuade Steven, yet he remains firm in his beliefs and refuses to give in. At the same time, he begins working desperately, hoping to quickly build the financial foundation needed to raise a child. But what he never expects is that one day when he returns home, he suddenly discovers that ISA has disappeared. ISA's clothes hangers are empty, and her luggage is gone, which means ISA may have left him forever. Heartbroken and desperate, Steven spends 4 painful years living in longing and waiting. Soon after, the First World War breaks out, and he resolutely chooses to join the army. He wants to erase his memories of ISA through the cruelty of war, so in every battle he charges forward bravely without fear of danger. Before long he rises from an ordinary soldier to a military officer. One day, while leading his troops to the rear for rest, he unexpectedly sees a familiar figure. He notices a woman whose back looks very much like ISA. As if possessed, he follows behind her just as he once followed ISA when he first fell in love. The woman seems to notice Steven behind her and begins to walk faster, but Steven continues following closely, impossible to shake off. Finally, the frightened woman gathers the courage to suddenly turn around. The moment she turns, Steven immediately stops in his tracks. He believes fate has been kind and that he has finally seen ISA again after all these years. Yet when he looks closely, he realizes the woman is not ISA but ISA's sister. Seeing that the person following her is Steven, the sister finally sighs with relief. Steven desperately begs her to take him to see ISA. He wants to ask ISA in person why she left him without a word 6 years ago, but the sister says that so many years have passed and wonders why he still wants to dig up the past. Yet the devoted Steven stubbornly insists on seeing ISA one more time. Finally, after his repeated pleas, the sister brings him to the house of Isa's former husband. After many years, Stephen finally sees Isa again. It turns out that after leaving Stephen 6 years earlier, Isa returned to her former husband not long afterward. Later, when the war began, her former husband was captured by German soldiers and his fate remains unknown, and during a bombing attack, Isa also received a permanent scar on her face. After hearing Isa's story, Stephen becomes furious. He had imagined countless reasons why Isa might have left him, but he never imagined she would abandon him and return to her former husband. Thinking about their passionate love in the past and the way they once ran away together, Stephen suddenly feels like a cruel joke. The deeper his love once was, the deeper his despair now becomes. He angrily shakes off Isa's hand and quickly turns around to leave. For the past few years, he has lived entirely in longing and waiting for Isa, which caused him to overlook many beautiful moments in life and reject countless chances to begin new relationships. Furious and overwhelmed, he walks straight into a brothel, hoping to release the anger inside him and make up for the happiness he missed while waiting for Isa all these years. But the moment he pushes the woman onto the bed, Isa's face appears again and again before his eyes. In the end, he does nothing at all, sitting in the woman's room and crying through the entire night. Early the next morning, as the sky just begins to brighten, the sorrowful and desperate Stephen once again leads his soldiers back toward the battlefield. As Stephen's whistle pierces the air, the soldiers climb out of the trenches and charge toward the German position. Shell after shell crashes down around Stephen, and one comrade after another falls beside him. Yet Stephen remains trapped in grief and despair, fighting even more fiercely and always leading every charge from the front. He wants to numb himself through the violence of war, because whenever he has a moment of quiet, Isa's face appears again and again before his eyes. He cannot endure such torment, and even now he still refuses to believe that Isa truly abandoned him. Time passes second by second as he continues fighting for survival, until one day, Isa's sister suddenly finds Stephen while he is on leave. She tells him that the real reason Isa left him back then was because she was already pregnant. Isa deeply wanted a child of her own, but at that time Stephen strongly opposed the idea because their financial situation was not good enough. In the end, Isa had no choice but to leave Stephen and secretly give birth to the child. Later, in order to survive and give the child a better life and education, Isa returned to her former husband, the businessman. After learning the true reason Isa left him all those years ago, Stephen desperately wants to see her again, but her sister tells him that the bombing which scarred Isa's face also left many injuries on her body. Those injuries eventually caused heart failure, and not long after that night when she saw Stephen again, she passed away. Her sister's words strike Stephen like a thunderbolt, shattering him completely. The sister then brings Stephen to her home. There Stephen meets a 7-year-old girl who is the daughter he and Isa had together. He stares silently at the 7-year-old girl in front of him, lost in thought. 7 years earlier his wife had disappeared without a word and returned to her former husband. Yet without knowing the truth, he foolishly waited for her for 7 long years. And in the end, the only news he receives is that Isa has already passed away. Now Isa's sister stands before him telling him that Isa left behind a 7-year-old daughter. At the moment he sees the child, memories of his past with Isa rush back into his mind. He will never forget the first time he saw Isa with that gentle yet anxious smile. The burning intensity of their first exchanged glance remains carved deeply into his memory. The accidental touch of their feet on the wooden boat is something he has never been able to forget. All those memories are what forged the painful longing he carried for 7 years. But the girl is his own flesh and blood, and Stephen begins trying to accept the 7-year-old child standing before him. Yet every gesture and every smile from the girl reminds him of Isa. In the end, he helplessly stands up, hides in a room, and breaks down in tears. From being an abandoned husband to suddenly becoming the father of a 7-year-old girl, the overwhelming change in identity is something he cannot accept. More importantly, every time he sees the girl he thinks of Isa. The torment Isa left him now far outweighs the happiness their love once brought. In the end, Stephen cannot accept his daughter and returns to the army once again. He wants to continue numbing himself through the violence of war, but on the brutal battlefield, the constant deaths of his comrades make the already depressed Stephen fall even deeper into despair. At this stage, the war has reached a stalemate, and in order to gain an advantage, the soldiers begin digging tunnels underground to approach the German lines. One day Stephen leads his team into the tunnel as usual to continue digging. Although they work carefully and try to make as little noise as possible, the German soldiers above eventually discover them. The Germans place explosives above their heads and detonate them. When Stephen slowly opens his eyes, he realizes that the entire squad has been wiped out. Only his closest friend remains alive with severe injuries and faint breathing. Steven quickly removes the dirt covering his friend and tries to rescue him, but the Germans set off more explosions above the tunnel, meaning they are about to be buried alive underground. His friend urges Steven to escape alone, but the stubborn Steven insists on taking him with him. Using all his strength, he carries his friend on his back and slowly moves forward through the tunnel. Above them, explosions continue echoing. Although the tunnels they dug had once connected in many directions, after searching for a long time they still cannot find an exit. Steven angrily curses the unfairness of fate. At this moment all the pain that had been buried deep inside him since ISA left him 7 years earlier finally bursts out. Through tears he tells his friend the story of himself and ISA for the first time. As he speaks, Steven suddenly realizes how desperately he wants to see his daughter again, even if it is only once. At this moment Steven finally understands that his daughter is not only his child but also the continuation of his love with ISA. With that realization Steven stands up once again and begins desperately searching the tunnel for an exit. By chance he discovers a crate of explosives left behind earlier by engineers. In their hopeless situation they suddenly see a faint chance of survival, but because they have only one crate of explosives, choosing the wrong direction would mean they could be trapped in the tunnel forever. After careful discussion, they finally decide on one direction to blast. Steven drags the explosives into position with great effort and lays out a line of gunpowder as a fuse. When he finishes and turns around, he realizes that his friend has already passed away from his injuries in the dark tunnel. Filled with sorrow, Steven takes out a match and strikes a small flame. He slowly lights the powder on the ground, and the burning line of fire draws a faint streak of light through the pitch-black tunnel. Steven knows that this small light could mean hope for survival or endless despair. At this final moment between life and death, everything from his past flashes through Steven's mind. Right now he only wants to return to his daughter's side. With a violent explosion, Steven finally sees the possibility of life again. At that moment he is reborn. He does not simply crawl out of the tunnel. He also emerges from the 7 years of suffocating pain he carried after ISA left him. Slowly rising after surviving the ordeal, he suddenly notices 2 German soldiers approaching from behind. Steven immediately raises his fists, ready to fight them with everything he has, because he knows he must survive and return to his daughter. But the 2 German soldiers tell him that the war has ended. As they speak, they even extend their hands in friendship. Steven pulls one of them into an embrace and begins to cry loudly. And at last, Steven returns to his daughter's side. I am a film enthusiast, and I look forward to meeting you again next time.